Alright, today I will be cleaning and rebuilding a carburetor on a 2005 Polaris Magnum 330. I've got the carburetor off of the four-wheeler already, but I was going to show you a couple steps to remove it off of the four-wheeler. We've got your throttle housing here, your thumb throttle here, and this has your all-wheel drive switch included with it. We've got our throttle cable that runs down and runs into our carburetor here under this black cover. To adjust the throttle cable on this model, you've got a small plastic lock nut here, and then you can move this back and forth. You never want to adjust this to adjust your idle. We've got a separate idle screw that I'll show you. This is primarily for allowing some slack in the cable. If you don't have any slack, you want to adjust your cable right here at this setting so that there is just a slight tiny bit of slack in this cable so that your throttle is not revved up. It's not engaging your carburetor here without even touching the throttle. So you want to make sure that there is a little bit of free play in that cable. We don't have nearly enough right here. This is too tight for a couple different reasons, and I'll show you those. So we're going to flip this over. We've got our throttle cable here. Like I said, we've got our choke cable here. To remove our throttle cable, and I've already turned this a couple screws out because it is a little bit time consuming to pull this throttle cable off. It's just an 8mm wrench, and you just loosen it like this. But before we do that, I like to remove this cover. There are 4 Phillips screws to remove this side cover here, and then we'll be able to see the throttle cable on the side here. So we've got the cover off. Make sure those screws stay together, they're the right size, and we've got our throttle cable coming down here. So the reason why that I started removing this cable already just to save a little bit of time so you weren't having to watch me do this constantly, as you can't get a real good turn on there. Once it is loosened though, a lot of times you can use your fingers and just turn that out. Now what you're going to do to remove this cable, I take and I push up on the actual butterfly, this arm here, and what that does is when you push the throttle on your thumb throttle, that opens up your butterfly here down in your carburetor. So same thing, if you adjust your idle here, this is your idle adjustment, you can use your fingers and your thumb to adjust this. You screw it clockwise and in will rev your four-wheeler up. Now when you do that, you can see there when you're idling your four-wheeler up or you're trying to get it to idle higher, you are opening this butterfly up a little bit more, allowing more air flow through there. So that's essentially, you hit your thumb throttle, you're pulling that up right there, and that is allowing more air flow through there, allowing more fuel to be sucked up from your bowl or your carburetor, and you will speed up. Now to remove this cable here, what I do is take a screwdriver, or if you can get in there with your thumb, and I like to hold it just like that, and I take this, I'm going to do this in a spot that you can see it, take this around and just pry up on this cable here, and it'll slide out of a groove. There's a little brass fitting that your cable will fit down into, and then it'll slide out of the groove that's in your butterfly. Now there's a groove also in this brass fitting that you can just slide that cable right out from the side. Now we can let our throttle go. We can finish unscrewing this. And then as soon as that's unscrewed, now it is a challenge because you're turning your entire throttle cable, so your throttle actually needs to spin with it so you don't break that cable there. So we've got that throttle up, now you just pull that cable out, now the throttle is off. Okay, now as far as our choke is concerned, we've got a 12mm metal screw here, a brass screw, and we loosen that up with this, and again there's not a lot of room in here to turn this, so a lot of times if it's not turning smoothly, you've got to put that wrench on there and turn it. It just takes a little while. Now underneath here is going to be our plunger, and there'll be a spring. So I'm going to spin this choke out so I can show you what it looks like there. Pull that out. There's your plunger, there's your spring. To remove your plunger now, what I do is take 2 fingers with a thumb and a finger here, pull back on the spring, and then that'll allow you to slide that cable out of that plunger. There's your plunger there. Now we have our spring disconnected there, and then our cap there can be removed as well. We've got an 8mm nut here, and then put your 12mm on there to remove that cap, and that cap will be separate. Now that we have the choke off of there, we're going to go and dig into this carburetor a little bit more. We're going to pull the bowl off. And I've explained the idle already, and we've got 4 screws down here that holds this bowl on. There's also a screw right here, and what this screw does is if you're needing to drain your fuel for, say, the winter, or if you're going on a long road trip, you can shut your fuel off. You can loosen this screw up a little bit, and your fuel will dump out this bottom nipple here. Now this nipple on this one happens to be broke off, and they do that when that carburetor loosens up on the four-wheeler and bounces around, and will damage that bottom nipple there. It's very, very small, but you do want to make sure that you've got a vent line hooked up to that, otherwise fuel is going to drip onto your motor when that fuel comes out of that overflow. And I'll show you that overflow here when we get this bowl off. But we've got 4 brass screws on the bottom of this bowl here. We'll remove these. And we have your bowl right here. Now this is the overflow that I was talking about, and you've got a small hole there on your tube, and let's let those screws drop there. When your fuel is bouncing around in your carburetor, or your float isn't set right, it will bounce around in your bowl here, dump out that little small hole there, and then dump out the bottom nipple here on the bottom of your bowl. So if you were to put compressed air up to here, or put your mouth on there and blow on here, you will have air coming out that bottom tab there. So that's the bowl. Going back together, you want to make sure that that O-ring is good. In a carb rebuild kit, you'll get that O-ring with the rebuild kit. Now the next thing we're going to do is pull your jets off, and this is how the four-wheeler runs and starts, is by these jets. So your enrichener, your choke cable will help your four-wheeler start, but your pilot jet here will help it when it's sitting there idling. This pilot jet is a 42.5, and it's a very, very small orifice on this pilot jet here, and it says that down here for your size, very, very small, but you want to make sure you have the correct size in there. Fuel will be sucked up, fuel will sit in your bowl, will be sucked up here. When you're not giving it any throttle, it will utilize this pilot jet. Even the finest piece of sand will cause that jet to be plugged up, and you will not be able to, your four-wheeler won't be able to idle. Now we've got a main jet here, and that's going to be right in the center of your carburetor, and it's going to have a little brass washer, so make sure you have that on your main jet going back together. This is going to be a 122.5 on this one, and depending on your altitude, riding conditions, what you have done for performance on your four-wheeler, this might be a different size jet. But we've got your main jet out there. You want to blow through it with compressed air. Use Carb&Choke cleaner. I prefer this Gum Out brand. Works really well, but you want to make sure you can see through that jet as well. You can see through it a little bit better when you're holding up to light. Also, you can get a set of these. These are jet cleaners, and they basically are ribbed small wires that you can stick through. Find the right size, and that'll help clean out jets as well. Now to pull your needle and seat there, the next thing you're going to want to do, I always grab a small pick here, and you can use different things, but you want a real small pick or a small screwdriver, and you've got a pin that runs through here that holds your float on. You want to be really careful when you're doing this. These are these are aluminum posts on your carburetor here, and these break off very, very easily. So you want to be really careful. If you use a small pick, make sure you're right in the center. Just a very light tap. A lot of times we'll get this pin started, and you can just pull it out just like that. Now we have your float here, and this is adjustable depending on if your four-wheeler is leaking fuel or not. When it's just sitting there, you can adjust this float here and shut your fuel off sooner if you need it to. And then here's the needle here. And you want to make sure that this rubber tip on here is in good condition. Make sure it's not grooved. Make sure there's no debris in there. If it is grooved or broken off or in rough shape, you want to replace that. I like to replace the seat as well while I'm doing it. Just take 2 Phillips screws off here, and you can replace your seat. That just pulls right out of there. So if those are all in good condition, slide your needle back in there, slide your float in, put your pin in, being really careful to get that in the right spot. I take a small screwdriver then. Make sure you don't hit this when you're doing this, but just tap it in there. Again, you want to make sure you don't damage these 2 posts here, or you will be replacing your carburetor. So we've got our brass washer there and your main jet. Make sure again that those are cleaned out. Snug those back up. These are brass and they're going into an aluminum carburetor, so whoops, you don't have to really torque those down. And then your main jet, and you can blow through your main jet orifice as well as your main jet, your pilot jet and your main jet holes there to make sure those are cleaned out. You can spray all this with Carb&Choke cleaner. And we will go ahead and slide our bowl back on there. Make sure that goes in the right direction. Put our screws back in there. And make sure that washer is in good condition. That O-ring is in good condition so that your fuel isn't leaking out of your bowl as well. So get this back on, snug these bolts up. Then we're going to flip this carburetor over and I'll show you the diaphragm. Now what's cool about this diaphragm is you can test it out, make sure it's working right. Grab compressed air, and if you take compressed air and blow in this groove here, your slide will go up and down. So that is as air would be flowing through your carburetor, it will be sucking that up as well. The other thing, we've got a vent line here that'll go on these 2 nipples here on the kind of the top of your carburetor, and these are just vents. You want to make sure that those are hooked up and venting where they need to go. Your this line here goes to your fuel pump as kind of a suck line here, so it's sucking air, and then we've got our fuel coming in here from our fuel tank, and that's going right into our bowl here. That goes to through that needle and seat like I showed you. That will periodically need replaced. Now to pull this top cap off here, we've again got 4 Phillips screws. We'll get these removed. I like to put my thumb over top, kind of hold the bottom of the carburetor so you can pick it up just like that. And I'll show you why I do that here when we get this cap off of here, but there is a spring underneath there, and it's not a spring with a lot of tension, so pieces aren't just going to go flying everywhere. But you want to make sure that this diaphragm does not ever get ripped. And so if we allow that cap to kind of pop off of there, and that diaphragm is kind of melted onto that cap a little bit, it could potentially rip that diaphragm. So I like to take this cap, pull it off carefully. That way if it's sticking to the cap, maybe some of it's sticking to the cap, maybe some of it's sticking to the carburetor. And if you split those, it could just rip that diaphragm. And it is crucial that this diaphragm stays in good condition. So diaphragm seals right there in that groove. When you're taking it off, make sure you, again, be really careful and inspect that. Make sure there's no leaks. Here is your spring there. I'll go through that here in a second. But we also have a jet right here that we can take out and clean, blow through that with compressed air. We can blow through all of this with Carb&Choke cleaner and compressed air to get all the dirt and debris out of there. And then your slide will slide right back down in there. Now I want to show you this a little bit here. We've got our spring, we can pull that out, and then we have our needle here, and this needle is adjustable on this model. You want to be really careful to put it back in the order that you took it apart. So push that needle out, and then we've got a plastic spacer on there that's kind of grooved, holds that spring in the right position, and then we've got your needle here. We've got a plastic spacer below your snap ring here that's on your needle. This needle is adjustable. Right now it's in the center position, which I believe is stock on this model, but you can adjust that depending on what performance, altitude, and riding conditions, like I said earlier. So just the same as replacing your main jet for performance, you can also replace this as well, or adjust this as well, and replace it if you need. But make sure that that plastic spacer is below the snap ring. Make sure this grooved plastic spacer is on top of it, and then you can drop that needle back down in there. Drop that down in there. Make sure you look down there to see that it sits in the right position. Now we're getting ready to stick that back into the carburetor, and your diaphragm can only go one position. You want to make sure that this notch here is in this groove here on top of your carburetor. Next thing, I like to do a little trick. I like to take and I like to push that down just like that, so it looks like a mushroom. I'll take and stick that down in here, and then I take my finger underneath here. Make sure that that needle lines up and goes right down into that main jet holder, right in the center there. But I'll take and I'll hold that up so it doesn't push down any farther than that. And then I'll sit there and make sure that that diaphragm is in that groove there. Make sure it's sealing properly. Take your cap there, put your spring down in that tab. Make sure that your cap goes in the right direction there. Set that down on top, and I'm still holding with my pointer finger that slide from pushing down, because if that slide pushes down, it could potentially take that diaphragm and pull it out of the groove that it's in. That groove that this diaphragm is in acts as a seal, so you want to make sure that those are in the right positions. Now, until I get a couple screws in there, I'll continue to hold that slide up. And then when I snug a couple down, I like to do a cross pattern here. When I snug these up, you can let go of that diaphragm, and then it'll slide right back down. That needle will slide right back down to where it needs to go. Go ahead and finish putting the screws in there. Snug these up, and again, they don't have to be really tight. If you do get them really tight, it'll just be a lot harder for the next time you've got to clean your carburetor, and you may need to use a small pair of vice grips to undo those screws. So unfortunately, that happens too often, is where these get tightened too much, and you've got to do that. I like to replace them. If you have to pull them off with vice grips, I like to replace those screws at that time, so you're not having to do that the next time. So that is a carb clean on a 2005 Polaris Magnum 330. That'll be the same on several different Polaris models, and I'll reference that in the comments below. Please leave any kind of feedback or comments in the comment section. Subscribe and like this video if it's been helpful. Share it with friends and family if they can benefit from it. So thanks a lot for watching.